Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to the part 2.5 of my third video game generation retrospective or recap series. If you're watching this in the playlist, the reason it's 2.5, and I guess this applies to anybody watching, is that I did not have this console when I made the series originally. Part 1 was about the generation as a whole, Part 2 was about the NES or Famicom, Part 3 would ultimately be the other Sega hardware in the third generation, the Sega Master System, and then Part 4, the Atari 7800, excuse me. But this console, the Sega SG-1000, Sega's first home console, as well as their first attempt at the third video game generation, I did not have, so there was no way I could do a video on it. But now, I have both versions. Well, technically there's 3, but we'll get into that. But I have these 2 anyway. So, the story behind this console is bizarre, and we're going to talk about it. We'll also talk about some of the games, and then we'll talk about kind of the history of it. But before we even get into my personal history of it, but before we go into any of that, I want to just kind of talk about the general vibe of this thing, and just kind of how weird the whole thing was, because this thing is definitely a Sega console, as far as like, it wouldn't be a Sega console if it didn't have some strange story behind it that was just like, how did you get from point A to point B on the logic of that? Why did you release this at all? Like, it's just a strange machine. But overall, it's something that's super exciting to me in retrospect to look back on, because it was not a console that ever came out here. It was not a console I had ever really even heard of until like high school, and that was only through extensive looking into it. So to most people in the West, and frankly I would think most people in general, because of how limited the release of this console was, for a Sega fan, this console is basically mythological. It's, if they even know what it is, it's like, have you ever seen one? No, I've never seen one. Do you even know anybody who has one? No, no way. Well, I do, and I want to talk to you about it right now. So, the history of this thing. Let's get started there. First, to set this up, you have to remember, at this point in time, when this thing was getting ready to come out, it was basically the late 70s, and the video game environment was very different. Arcades were dominant. If you were a home console, unless you were named Atari, you were probably not super successful, but you were trying anyway. And Atari was like absolutely crushing everybody. Arcades are super successful. These crazy new box machines that no one can figure out, called PCs, are just starting to take off. And then pinballs are still all the rage. Very different time than what we have now. So at that point in time, arcades in particular was really where this thing got its origin. There was a company called Gulf and Western, who actually no longer exists. They've since become part of Paramount Studios, or Paramount Pictures. But basically, that company, believe it or not, actually owned Sega. And if you did not know that, Sega was actually an American company for many years, founded originally in Hawaii, and then ultimately ended up with Gulf and Western for a long time. Now, when they were with Gulf and Western, they were the #1 arm of Gulf and Western for arcade hardware. So they were making tons of stuff, and they were super successful at that. But Gulf and Western seemed to be the only guys who saw the writing on the wall. The video game crash of 1983 had not happened yet, but these guys, maybe they saw it coming, to an extent, and they got themselves half out of the pool. And by that I mean they looked at it and went, I don't know if we want to compete with arcades anymore. So they actually diluted their entire assets of their arcade division and sold them off to, at that time, their #1 opponent, Bally. Bally Arcades ended up absorbing all their stuff, save the exception of Sega, Service Games, who remained under Gulf and Western. Gulf and Western told them, we don't want to do arcades anymore, you guys were good at that, but we're going to do something else. We want you to go come up with a new project, figure something out and get back to us. So Sega basically said okay, and then they looked into their options, and the Japanese division of Sega at the time basically said, like, we got it, we have an idea. At that point in time, like I said, these magical boxes called PCs were just starting to take off. And they said, what if we do that? What if we make one of these personal computers with Sega stuff and it plays games? And they're like, that's a great idea. So they worked on this thing called the SC-3000. Now, I don't have an SC-3000. I've seen one once. I had the opportunity to buy it, but it was just very expensive. It was basically all the hardware that ultimately is in the SG-1000 And plus it had a lot of extra room for expansion ports, and you could put a keyboard on it and all sorts of stuff. And it would play a lot of games. And the idea was that computers in Japan were just starting to take off, just a little bit. And maybe these guys, maybe Sega could be the guys to get the foothold there and control the Japanese computer market. Then they got wind of this little company called Nintendo and heard about this thing called the Famicom that they were starting to work on. Wow, that thing looks neat. It also is a lot cheaper, it looks a lot more capable than our machine, and it's probably going to sell a lot better. What if we maybe try to do that? We don't have time to do that. We've been putting all the assets into this thing. Well, what if we take that stuff, you know, just kind of water it down a little and put it in a little cartoony looking box and say, there's your console. Yeah, we can do that. That's why we have the Sega SG-1000. This thing, for all intents and purposes, is the Sega SG-3000. It's just got a lot of the expansion ports taken off of it and a lot of that stuff removed from it. And it's just the bare bones to be able to play a game. Now, man, Sega was crazy, and there was an infamous day there in history. July 13th, 1983 was crazy because it had to be this way. Knowing what we know about Sega now and how insane they were with their hardware, with all the constant revisions and constant new versions and changes and literally fighting with themselves sometimes over different markets, it had to start this way. They had to release the Sega SC-3000 and the Sega SG-1000 on the same day. Both of them came out on July 13th, 1983. You know what else did? The Nintendo Famicom. There's a crazy day in gaming history. Both Sega and Nintendo launched both of their first consoles on the exact same day. And in true Sega fashion, they launched two. So whatever, that was bananas. Now it goes to, without saying that obviously the Famicom ended up being a giant success and the Sega SG-1000 did not. The Famicom ended up becoming the NES and basically taking the world by storm. It is also the thing that ultimately saved the video game industry after the video game crash, and I don't mean to go on a tangent here, but the video game crash, I see a lot of comments over the years, particularly from people from Europe who are like, hey man, the video game crash only happened in North America, so it didn't affect us. And it's like, well, technically that's true in the extremely short term. It's kind of like saying, hey man, I only got cancer in my stomach, so it didn't affect my brain. Well, we removed the tumor. That's the reason you didn't die. That's essentially how that worked. That's how economics works. It's a very global thing. Nintendo ultimately saved it here so that it saved the entirety of the global economics of the gaming industry and then unified it under one similar set of rules that is still followed to this day. But at the time, it was the Wild West. It was completely insane. Like I said, Sega released two consoles on the same day, one sort of a computer, and then ultimately another console completely a couple years later in the same generation. The rules were a little different back then. But that said, so Nintendo goes on and they make the Famicom, which we've already talked about, and it was a juggernaut. But Sega, on the other hand, did not have that kind of success. Their marketing budget for this thing was incredibly limited. It only came out in a handful of countries, most notably Japan, which is really sort of where it was birthed, and we'll get back to that. They obviously had it, but it had a couple of odd regional releases. The only part of Europe I'm aware of that it came out in at all was Italy, specifically for some reason. I don't know why. It also came out in New Zealand. Again, don't know why, and it makes New Zealand the only English-speaking country to have gotten a release of it, at least natively English-speaking country. And then the only place where it actually did well is it came out in Taiwan. And the only reason it did well in Taiwan is because the Famicom was never released there. So it didn't have that competition. But eventually the Fami clones all started showing up, and that completely killed off the Sega SG-1000. Funny enough, there were clones of the Sega SG-1000 that actually did come out in the United States. And it's funny because they were Sega SG-1000 clones, but they could actually play ColecoVision games. And they were marketed more as ColecoVision clones. They could play that stuff. And then it's like, people were just realizing years later, oh, it can play SG-1000 games. How bizarre. But really, it was meant to be the other way around. So you can kind of count that as a release, though I definitely wouldn't. But yeah, so needless to say, that did not do well. So Gulf and Western goes ahead and looks at all this and just says, video game crash happens, our Sega computer doesn't work, our Sega console doesn't work, Audi 5000. And they decided to sell off Sega to a Japanese company called CSK. And in that acquisition, we got the Sega that we know today. What's really fascinating about that is that you can actually make the case that the Sega SG-1000, this version in particular, is actually an American console. Now, a lot wouldn't because the engineers of it were in Japan. It was released basically only in Japan. But at the time, Sega as a company was American. But yes, so that was that. Now, it eventually kind of changes a bit. Once Sega becomes the full-on Japanese version of themselves, they decide, we're going to make some changes. They looked at the Sega SG-1000 Model 1, they saw its problems. So let's ourselves go ahead and do that. When you take a look at this console, I like the look of it for the time it came out in. To me, it looks like the 1970s depiction of a robot or something, like maybe what they thought a Roomba would eventually look like. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how else to put it. It's got these kind of, I mean, the vents aren't pointless, but they're kind of pointless. It does have a port on the back, so there are things that can connect to it. It only has RF out. The power switch is on the back, which is a little strange, right next to the power supply, the DC input. It also has a single power LED and a reset switch on the front, taking, of course, its cartridge-based games. There is a hardwired controller, and of course the controller itself is just garbage. It's the, you know, that late 70s, really early 80s idea of let's replicate the arcade at home with these like sticks that really don't age very well. What's even stranger about that decision is that there is a second controller port, and it's not hardwired. It can use a 9-pin, you know, controller. The same port that actually eventually would exist on the Master System, the Mark II right here, or the SG-1000 II, the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive, the same one that's also on like the Atari 2600, which is most likely why they use this particular port, is on here as well. And they did sell, you know, they sold first-party controllers that look like this, that plug into that port. What blows my mind about that is that decision. Why hardwire one, and then also at the same time acknowledge that hardwiring is bad by having this as a secondary option? I can only assume that they thought, hey, we need to give you at least one controller, so that'll be part of it. And if they want to go buy another one, then they can do that. Unlike Famicom that hardwired both, but then had that weird third port in the front. But essentially, that's the console right there. From a technological standpoint, most people would argue this doesn't really belong in the third generation. What puts it in the third generation is mostly its timing. From a hardware standpoint, this thing has a lot more in common with, say, a ColecoVision or an Intellivision than it does with, say, a Famicom or an Atari 7800. It's just vastly underpowered compared to those consoles. But that said, they looked at that and went, we can make some changes. And they ultimately went on to make this, the Sega SG-1000 Mark II. Now this is the vastly more common version of the console. I've seen this many times for sale in Japan. I've seen it many times on eBay. When you look for the version of the console, this is usually what you'll find. Now they made some notable changes. First and foremost, they fixed that problem. They decided, hey, you know what? Hardwired controllers are a terrible idea. Let's not do that. And they put them on the side right here. They're detachable. And on the back, they have the ports, like I said, that 9-pin port, and you can just plug into that. The controllers themselves are designed to look a lot like Famicom controllers, as that had become the new accepted standard of how people wanted to interact with a video game console. And at the same time, this to me, the only way I can describe this, and maybe you'll agree with me just by looking at it, maybe you'll see what I'm talking about. This to me looks like exactly how I think the 80s would have depicted the year 2000. Like, it embodies that. It's the epitome of that. It feels like this is the year 2000. That's just how it comes off to me from the standpoint of someone echoing that from 1985. But yes, that ultimately right there is the SG-1000 II. And it has a port, the same port on the front there for other expansion options. Another choice that was made with this console that's very strange is we look here at the games, and we'll go over some of them in a minute, but the games themselves were primarily made on these black cartridges, which would just go into the top of the console, no problem, or the top of the console here. But when the console became a fully Japanese realization, someone over at Sega had the really strange idea that, I don't like these cartridges. Well, why don't you like the cartridges? I don't like those cartridges because they look like tombstones. What? So what are we supposed to do about that? Forget cartridges. We're not doing that anymore. We're going to put our games on these little things called Sega My Cards. Now the Sega My Card looks like a PC Engine card or a TurboGrafx card. They started making games for the SG-1000 on those cards. Now there's a little bit of a problem with that. The SG-1000 doesn't have a port for that. Right. How does that work then? Well, they decided, oh, no, that's fine. We will actually release this little adapter, and then you put the cards in the adapter, and then the adapter goes in the console. Now, this probably would have been a bigger deal had the SG-1000 actually been successful. It would have been, I don't even know how to put that in, like, into frame, like, you know, like no other console thought to do that, because it's just such a weird idea. Like, until reading about it, I was like, who would think to do that? That's such a bizarre concept. Most people see those Sega My Cards and just assume they're part of the Sega Mark III or the Master System, because the Master System did actually natively have a port on the front designed to play those type of cards. But that was backwards compatibility. It wasn't actually meant for that. They were meant for this console and just delivered in a very strange method. But ultimately, yeah, that was a decision. But in the end, there were only something like 80 games released anyway, and maybe like 20 of them were on those cards, and then like the other 60 were on these cartridges. So it didn't really matter. By 1985, the console was completely discontinued, and Sega had moved on with the Sega Mark III, which would ultimately become the Sega Master System. Now, interestingly, the Sega Master System and the Sega Mark III specifically had native backwards compatibility with this console. Its cartridges played straight up, and the Sega My Cards played straight up. The Master System, however, the version that we would eventually get, and the version that would come out in Europe, of course, and still is active in Brazil for some reason, that version of the console has the hardware inside of it to play Sega SG-1000 games. But because they changed the shape of the cartridge, you couldn't actually use them. The only way you can actually still kind of access them is if you actually have a Sega Master System EverDrive and you put SG-1000 ROMs on it, it will play them. The hardware is all there. It's just like how the Sega Genesis can play Sega Master System games through an EverDrive, but just the hardware is all inside, the cartridge is just different. But at least in the Genesis or Mega Drive's case, they released an adapter to make that possible. They just didn't do that with the Master System. Strange. Well, not too strange, considering the Master System, as we know it, really only came out here. It did technically get a Japanese release, but since this console never came out here, there was no reason to bother. It's just bizarre. But yeah, so that's kind of the history in a nutshell. It wasn't super successful, and in true Sega fashion, they basically did 3 versions of the same console in 2 years. And then ultimately dropped it and moved on to something else when it didn't work, which was a sad precedent that Sega would ultimately set, that they would continue to sadly do all the way until they were not making hardware anymore. But hey, that's just how they were. So now let's talk about some of the games. Now, unfortunately, I do not have any of the Sega My Card games, nor do I have that little adapter, but I do have several of the cartridge games. I don't have anything particularly amazing here, but I'll go over the ones I've got. Champion Baseball, Champion Tennis, Flicky, which was at one time a big Sega franchise, but it's not a good one and it doesn't need to come back. GP World, this one was actually kind of interesting because there was a race controller made specifically for this game. Some sort of Mahjong game, some other type of Mahjong game, Pachinko 2, which is very, very misleading. Its artwork looks like some sort of cool shoot 'em up. It's got ships everywhere and all that stuff, and I'm sure that's the whole point. And then it's just a Pachinko game. This one I got because I found it and I thought it was just weird. Sinbad Mystery. Not Sinbad Mystery, Sinbad Mystery, which I'm pretty sure is a typo. But there it is. And then Zaxxon, which is a cool, like, shoot 'em up. But basically, when it came to the games, you have to remember the era this thing came out in. It was designed to compete against a lot of the big arcade type of games of that time. So there's a lot of clones of stuff that you guys would know from that era, including Galaga and all those types of things. A lot of Sega's own versions of that are on there. Donkey Kong clones, named things like Congo Bongo, are on there. Games like that, from that era, there's a lot of just Sega's home versions. This console had essentially no third-party support. Sega wasn't in any great position to, approach third-party developers, and it wasn't something they would even really get through until they got to the Genesis or Mega Drive, because Nintendo was just so much better at attracting people that way. There was a couple. The only one I know of offhand, I know Activision did a couple of titles for it. I know both Yu Suzuki and Yuji Naka. Yuji Naka would ultimately make Sonic the Hedgehog, and Yu Suzuki, of course, makes Virtua Fighter and Outrun and Afterburner, Hang On, and Shenmue, a little indie game. Makes all that stuff, but both of them did actually make games for this platform. So, yeah, it is a full-on Sega console, but interestingly, because it is the first and only time Sega, as an American company, made a console. And I know people will be like, but the 32X was American design. It's like Sega wasn't an American company at the time. They just let the American division do it. While also being the first time Sega, as a Japanese company, made a console, which is crazy. So, all that out of the way, the only other thing I really want to talk about here is kind of my experience with it. And what I want to say there is, when I was growing up, this was certainly not a console I had ever heard of. No one had in this part of the world, because why would you? It was so comically limited in reception in the places where it actually was released, much less places it wasn't. And this is all pre-internet. So you're not going to hear about this thing. It wasn't until I was in high school, after the Dreamcast had been discontinued, I got this kind of desire to learn a lot about the history of Sega, because I was like, Sega was my childhood, you know, the Genesis, like that was such a big piece to me. So when they went under after the Dreamcast, it was kind of like shell shock. So I wanted to learn about this company that I had grown up with and never really knew. Only to find, like, hey, they actually had a console before the Genesis. Did you know about it? It's called the Master System. And that blew my mind. And to a lot of people in Europe in particular, I'm sure that's kind of a surprising statement, because the Master System was so popular there. But in North America, the Master System was not a success at all. It's a very uncommon console here. But then to find out that there was one before the Master System, and that the Genesis was actually their third, provided you're talking about completely new hardware, then damn, like that was strange to find that out. So looking into it even more, I'm just like, that's fascinating. And you would find that the Sega SG-1000 II was the vastly more common version, ultimately because that's the one they just produced more units of and sold more units of, because they frankly did a lot more right with it. But then seeing, like, what is the SG-1000? When am I going to see that? When am I going to find that? And I looked into it at one point, you know, mostly when I was doing this channel, and I was like, maybe it'd be kind of cool to get one for the channel, you know, that'd be cool. And I'm looking into it, and it's like prohibitively expensive. They're super expensive to ship from Japan. Most of the time you can only find this one. And whenever I did see this one, it was always like super yellowed. It didn't work. It didn't have anything with it. It was in bad shape, whatever. And it was always very expensive. And I just kind of always assumed, like, never going to own that. That's never going to happen. So before we get to the story about that, even though we're kind of going out of order here, I want to just get this story out of the way when it came to the SG-1000 II. This one I don't have any great story with. Like, I was in Japan, I went to a store, a Book Off specifically, and I saw it. I saw it in the box, and it wasn't even that expensive, and I was like, I'm going to rescue this thing. I'm going to get this. I'm going to bring this home. Got some games for it, some of the ones that are here. And that was it. There was no other, like, great story to it, because by that point I already had this one, and I just wanted to kind of complete the set, aside from the SC-3000, which I've only seen once, and like I said, was very expensive. Nevertheless, that's how I got this one, just the time I was in Japan. This one, though, is where the story is. This one, like I said, as a Sega fan, is very mythological. Like, Sega themselves barely acknowledges this console. I went to Sega Fest 2018. They had one there to, like, kind of celebrate their whole history. But aside from that, they don't really do much with it. Their capsule toy sets never really, like, include it. Sometimes if they do, they include this version. This t-shirt I'm wearing that Sega of America gave out at E3 this year in 2019 actually does have this version of the SG-1000 on it. It actually also has this. It has both represented, which is awesome. Maybe that's because it's an American, you know, technically console, I guess. I don't know. Or that's just a coincidence. I'm not sure. But either way, they did do that. But the console itself, like, it never sees much representation. And I've been to Japan, as I'm sure a lot of you guys who watch this channel know. I've been there quite a few times, and I look for a lot of stuff. I've seen one of these once for sale, ever. And it's at a Super Potato. I think it's one in Osaka. And it's the same one. I've seen it every time I go there, because they can't get rid of it, because it's too expensive for anybody to actually put down and buy it. So on my first trip to Japan, I remember seeing it there and being like, man, wouldn't that be crazy? But going right before my first trip to Japan, I had received a message from a guy named Levi Roach, or at least that's the username he uses. He contacts me and he's like, hey man, I love your channel and I want to help you out. I've actually got this thing I don't want anymore and I'd love to hook you up with it. I don't need it. Now, I told him what I always tell people, which is like, you don't have to send me stuff, dude. Like, you don't need to do that. And it's true. Nobody has to send me anything. I don't expect that of anyone. And he's like, no, I'd really like you to have this thing. I think you're really going to want it. And I kept kind of pushing back because I was just like, you don't need to do that. And eventually he kind of was like, he just sends me pictures of it. He's like, I think you want this, dude. And so, because I had been talking about this thing for years about how cool it would be to have one. And he had a boxed Sega SG-1000. And he didn't want it. And I was like, dude, you know what that is. Like, no. And he was like, no, I know what it is. I fully understand. I know what it's worth. I don't care. I don't want it. He's like, it's the sound on it doesn't work, and I'm never going to use it. I don't want it. And I was like, because I was just stunned. And he's like, look, if you don't want it, man, I'm gonna either give it to someone else or just chuck it. And I was like, well, don't do that. So eventually he talked me into it, and I let him send it. So it actually arrived at the exact same day I was in Japan the first time and saw one for sale. But I didn't know that. I found out about that after the fact. Because there was such a great amount of time between him saying he was going to send it and when I actually got it that I just, to be honest with you, kind of forgot about it because stuff like that will happen. So when I came back, there was this package, and it kind of hit me what it was. And I saved it until I made a video about it. And you can see it. It's on this channel. There's some episode of Playload like 2 years ago where I'm going through a bunch of stuff, and the very end is this big box. And I saved it intentionally as the last thing, and I just kind of fangasm on it. I'm just like, oh my God, it's real. It's right there. Because it's hard to believe. As a Sega fan, like, here it is. Here's the Sega SG-1000. The beginning of Sega's entire console history just is right there. Go ahead. Incidentally, the sound on it does work, and I showed him. Like, I didn't have any problem. I don't know what issue he was having, but he was like, oh, well, enjoy, great. It's in beautiful condition. He clearly took good care of it. And like I said, it does have the box. I still have the box. Same with that one. And it's cool because I don't know anybody else who has an SG-1000, particularly this version. I'm sure there are people out there who do. But it's very cool to actually have one and be able to show you guys and just discuss it and preserve it and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, thank you very much to Levi Roach. I hope you guys will say thank you to him too, because that's like a huge thing for someone to do that he really didn't have to do. So that'll about do it for this particular video. If you guys would please like, comment, subscribe, and all that great stuff, I really appreciate that. Stay tuned if you hadn't seen this series originally. What was with the beard back then, by the way? Like, I looked back on some of that and I was like, poof, like just insane. Like, sorry about that. I don't know what I was thinking. It's better like this, isn't it? Anyway, so the next one up will be Sega Master System. Interestingly, when you watch that video, I did not have a Sega Mark III to go along with it. I do now, but now there's really no place to make a video on it. So maybe someday we'll figure that out in a different way. But either way, that'll be up next. So thank you guys very much for watching. Again, like, comment, subscribe. I really appreciate all that stuff. Social media stuff's in the description. Please click on that. Instagram, Twitter, whatever. Please do so. Thank you very much, and I'll see you all later.